Hello, greeting fight fans. This is the historical overview of the pioneer fighter George Godfrey, the original George Godfrey, the old chocolate George Godfrey. Godfrey is one of the very oldest on our birth years master log. Godfrey was born in the year 1853. There's only one fighter that was born before George Godfrey. If anybody cares to take a guess, that fighter was born in 1851, and he was one of the nemesis to Peter Jackson. I'm talking about Bill Varnon, the original oldest man on the master log of our birth years. Godfrey is just number 2. So Godfrey was a very unique, and I do believe he was one of the very first genetic freaks in that he completely bucked the norm of what was happening at the time, as most fighters were entering the end of their prime at the age of 27, particularly in this pioneer era. Godfrey was just getting started at the age of 27, and by the time he was 35 years old, he became a major draw against Peter Jackson during the beginning of the Australian invasion, which I do a video to previously, their entire bout. And Godfrey was the one that stepped up to the plate because it all started because in the spring there, Sullivan refused to fight Godfrey. So then, therefore, Godfrey was recognized as the major draw. And then when Jackson came over again, Sullivan drawed the color line. And so Godfrey, the other black, fought Peter Jackson, another black. And they were the first big draw, the first American big international draw fight, before the likes of Jake Kilrain and before James Corbett was the original George Godfrey. And long before there was Jack Johnson marrying white women, George Godfrey was the original to do it. He was the black guy that burst upon the scene and fought, married a white woman and fought white opponents. Godfrey was one of the oldest starts to his career, like I said, in this entire era, starting at the age of 27, essentially. He was at the very age that most people have their prime ended. So at the age of 36 in 1889, he faces two pioneer fighters, Joe Landon and Jack Ashton. Both of these were white fighters, near the top at the time of 1889. Godfrey beats both of those at the age of 36. At the age of 37, in the spring of 1890, he faces Patsy Cardiff, fresh off his loss to another Australian, Peter Jackson. And Cardiff's next fight was against George Godfrey. And Godfrey has some success there against the number one heavyweight challenger, Patsy Cardiff. And again, here at the age of 37, in the year 1890, he faces another foreign fighter in Denver, Ed Smith. Now, Denver Ed Smith wasn't really part of the Australian invasion coming into America, but he was a foreign fighter, and he's got an early start in Chicago. And this produces one of the all-time great matches of all times, as we have the very young, strapping, tough individual in Denver, Ed Smith, against age 37-year-old George Godfrey. And Godfrey, one of the things that was known for him was that after his loss to Peter Jackson, he essentially became even more popular because he was known as a very game man and to put on a very good boxing exhibition, a very good show, because he was not going to go down easily. So he became an extreme fan favorite after the fight with Jackson. His popularity probably rose. So I'm going to do a few readings here of different things here. This first, I'm going to read out of the book of the essays on the Black Pioneer Fighters, and I'm going to read you just about the very beginning of George Godfrey, where he came from and how he got his start. Okay, we're going to do a reading from, this is from the first Black Boxing Champions book, Essays on Fighters, and we're going to learn here about George Godfrey as I read from the book. Godfrey left Prince Edward's Island in his youth around 1870 and traveled to Massachusetts, Boston, therefore calling the hub city home. Boston has long been called the hub city by New Englanders who consider it the hub of the universe. Godfrey found work as a porter in one of the Boston's silk importing offices. By 1879, at the late age of 26, he had taken up boxing and began fighting competitively during what was still known as the bare knuckle era. At this time, he could not afford to support himself through prize fighting, so he worked during the day as a beef carrier in the Boston market. He did all his training and fighting at nights. Later, he married a white woman and worked as a carpenter while he still tried to make it in the fight game. The origin of Godfrey's fight name is difficult to fathom because he was not especially aged by today's standards. He was so light-skinned that his subsequent heirs considered their race to be white. However, 26-year-old was considered old for one first entering the sport in the late 1800s, and chocolate was a common epithet for blacks of the period. A similar ring name, Little Chocolate, was given to George Dixon, a smaller contemporary black boxer from Halifax. Boston was noted for the sport of boxing, and Godfrey followed to the arena by several other black fighters from the Bog area of Canada, notably George Byers, a prominent turn-of-the-century middleweight. Godfrey's fame as a boxing star would rise in the eastern horizon simultaneously with white boxers such as John L. Sullivan and Jake Kilrain. Godfrey was trained by a notable black professional, Professor John Bailey, who ran the Hub City Gym in downtown Boston. At Bailey's club, Godfrey was first matched with John L. Sullivan in the year 1880. The match earned Godfrey a great deal of notoriety. Both fighters hailed from Boston, but they could lick one another in the fight business, and consequently both headed for a showdown. On September 21st, 1880, Sullivan and Godfrey agreed to fight to the finish at Bailey's gym. What occurred that night was debated for years to come. It appears that both fighters were dressed and ready to fight, but once the police were informed of the fight, the fight was halted before the first round. Godfrey would go to his grave claiming that Sullivan conspired with the police to have the bout canceled so that Sullivan would not have to face him and risk losing. Sullivan would later say that he would never fight a black man. Godfrey would spend the rest of his fighting life challenging Sullivan, but the Boston boy never answered that challenge. George Godfrey's careers interacted with another white heavyweight, Jake Kilrain, had different results. On January 15th, 1882, in Boston, in the early bout of their careers, Godfrey fought Kilrain to a draw in 3 rounds. Kilrain won their second 3-round bout on May 16th, 1883, the very next year. The two would not fight again until Godfrey was far past his prime in March of 1891, a full 8 years later. The week after the first Kilrain fight in 1882, Godfrey traveled to New York to fight Professor Charles Hadley, a noted black boxer. The two fought to a draw for the black heavyweight title. Again, Godfrey met the professor in New York in a tournament in an official title in the contest beginning on February 7th of 1883. The best black men were invited to a tournament sponsored by boxing enthusiast and newspaper publisher Richard Fox. to contend for the National Police Gazette belt for the colored heavyweight champion. Nate Fleischer mentioned that this belt as being the heavyweight championship of the colored race. The event was apparently the origin of the title, which would be used well into the 1920s. Godfrey won the title and successfully held the heavyweight colored title, defending it for 5 years against the likes of McHenry Johnson, whom he fought 3 times. Godfrey maintained the title until he was bested by the Australian Peter Jackson when he came to the United States in the year 1888. The second half of Godfrey's career would find him in the ring with stellar heavyweights Peter Jackson in 1888, Jake Kilrain in 1891, Joe Choyinski in 1892, and Peter Maher in 1894. Far older than his opponents, Godfrey would lose to these distinguished men of the ring. It is an interesting fact that unlike others whose stars faded after they began to lose, Godfrey's reputation all the more heroic during the later part of his career. He was the one man during this era whose name was synonymous with gameness. His bouts in the ring displayed courage and sportsmanship, and for that reasons, many younger fighters looked to him for their education and training. As George Godfrey became known as Professor George Godfrey, operating at training out of the city hub of Boston Gym, and he became known as the Professor George Godfrey. During his fight with Peter Jackson, he was referred to in the paper as Professor George Godfrey, teacher and manager. Okay, so before we begin the very next section here, we're going to talk about George Godfrey and the way he looked. Godfrey always personally reminded me of kind of a Mexican outlaw. That's sort of what he looked like when he was young. You know, most people only know him for the older dated picture where he's in his late 30s, but the younger version of Godfrey kind of reminded me of a Mexican outlaw like Pancho Villa. And Godfrey kind of hanged out with Wild West characters himself, as he had a very strong relationship with the gunfighter Bat Masterson, who was involved with boxing. And Godfrey and Masterson were very good friends. And we can see here from this picture, we're going to show what the young outlaw version of George Godfrey looked like right here, complete with a couple of bullet holes. Godfrey was as good at dodging bullets as he was at dodging punches. That's what Bat Masterson said. So we're going to discuss a reading from here about the second half of Godfrey's career, and we're going to do a nice reading here. So, by January 1888, Godfrey had been the colored heavyweight champion nearly 5 years, since his 6th round knockout of Professor Charles Hadley. John L. Sullivan remained the undefeated white heavyweight champion, but his out-of-ring behavior was affecting his dominance. Sullivan's severe alcoholism led to severe, ugly incidents when he would lose his temper publicly. Privately, he beat men, he beat maids, and he beat ex-wives. There were several arrests, but nothing deemed serious. While he could be a generous man and a soft touch for money, he spent more money than his massive, for its time, boxing income provided. Sullivan hated prize fighting and destined retirement for years, but his investments, including jewelry, gambling, and owning a tavern, all went bankrupt on him as he was forced to continue his tours of John L. Sullivan's outsized personality was probably better for boxing than George Godfrey's reserved modesty. Sullivan's presence alone was a public event. When he recently visited London, England, paid for boxing exhibitions. Among his admirers was the Prince of Wales. Sullivan would have no concept or protocol for European royalty. At the National Sporting Club, the playboy sportsman Prince introduced himself to Sullivan, who promptly felt that he was meeting another admirer, only this guy wealthier. Sullivan said to the Prince, "I think I've heard of you." Sullivan then slapped the future Prince on his shoulders and added, "If you're ever in Boston, look me up." John L. Sullivan remained boxing's biggest draw, with 6,000 people in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Fans visiting and viewing his disappointing January 1887 sixth-round draw versus Patsy Cardiff. Sullivan was fortunate to retain the title. Cardiff utilized defensive backing with movements of each round where he would step forward and land 2 or 3 punches with superior hand speed and then back again. Sullivan later claimed a first-round injury was the reason for his lackluster performance. The reality is his weight, and announced himself as the gloved champion. His weight was 35 pounds heavier than his dominant days before, after he won the 82 bare knuckle title and announced himself as gloved champion. Sullivan might not have won a round against Cardiff, with the latter's punching frequency superior. Cardiff didn't land hard punches, but did draw first blood. The referee was the sole judge and probably gave Sullivan credit as the offensive aggressor, however ineffective it was. The draw was the first blemish to Sullivan's unbeaten record. Minneapolis Dispatch. The general impression is that Cardiff had the best of the fight from first to last, getting in 3 blows on Sullivan's face, pushing him into the ropes twice, and clearly avoiding Sullivan's attacks, and coming out of the end of the 6th round as fresh as when he went into the fight. George Godfrey remained in the Boston region, but was unable to find financial backing for a major bout. He fought some 3-round exhibitions against Tom Foley on the undercard to John L. Sullivan, Steve Taylor, and Mike Cleary in Boston, with Godfrey landing some clean, uncontested punches versus Godfrey to polite applause from the crowd. Godfrey sparred with White Jack Loring as the undercard of the Sullivan Al Greenfield main event. Sullivan and Laurie performed an entertaining fake boxing show with seemingly hard punches. Sullivan promised not to inflict much damage for his 4-round prearranged draw. The booing crowd more forgiving when Sullivan announced from the ring that law enforcement had tied his hands, or he'd love to knock out the alleged English champion. The popular Baltimore heavyweight Jake Kilrain was the master of ceremonies for the Godfrey Jimmy Doherty bout in front of 200 Boston fans. Doherty was white, so it was a non-title bout, but it may have been Godfrey at a peak of his boxing prowess. Godfrey dominated Doherty with 3 knockdowns during the first round. Victory. Bat Masterson was a tremendous boxing fan who admired George Godfrey. The former Kansas lawman, gunfighter, possesses influence with the wealthiest backers, luring Godfrey to his home state, Colorado, to defend his colored world heavyweight champion versus McHenry Johnson. Masterson would also act as Godfrey's handler for what could be a $800 payday. Godfrey was probably offered more initially, but boxing had always been a bit sleazy with regards to the money offer and then leaning otherwise. Whatever Johnson had been offered, which was at least included opportunity to win the colored heavyweight champion. The title could possibly be parlayed into a future financial windfall. If McHenry lost, he would walk away with a mere $50. This is the fight versus McHenry Johnson. Gloved bout. Johnson at 182 pounds, known as the Black Star from Baltimore, 35-year-old Canadian champion George Godfrey has Bat Masterson as his handler. Crowd, 400 people who paid $5 apiece in advance prize, $800 for the winner, $50 for the loser. Round 1, both cautious. Johnson defensive, but one over several times. Champion lands a right on the cheek, both circle. Johnson lands a hard right to the mouth. Blood oozes from Godfrey as he smiles. The champion attempts several rights, all miss as Johnson backs. Several clinches and separation. Godfrey lands a couple light jabs to the head. Damage minimal as Johnson moves and backs. Round 2, champion determined as he steps forward. Johnson backs. Godfrey continues forward. Johnson dances and backs. Godfrey pursues and lands a right to the body. Johnson backs and Godfrey lands a left to the body. Johnson backs. Godfrey steps forward and lands hard right to the body. Johnson shrieks as he backs. Crowd grumbles and shouts for more action. Godfrey steps forward as Johnson clinches. Round 3. The champion steps forward. Johnson back. Godfrey throws a right hand a couple times, misses Johnson's back. Godfrey traps foe towards the corner ring, lands a hard right to the chin, feints a left, and lands a right to the shoulder. Johnson falls to the canvas. Referee counts 1, 2, 3, 4. Johnson lifts himself to the knees and begins to rise. Godfrey steps forward and lands a right to the face. Johnson knocked flat to the ground on his back. Johnson's cornermen enter the ring and argue with the referee with shouts of foul. All heck breaking loose. Some fans yell for disqualification and others yell for the bout to continue. The referee confused by the disruption. Johnson uses the opportunity to crawl along the ground and lift himself to the ropes. Time is called to end the ring chaos. Round 4, Johnson's lip is cut while face grotesquely swollen. Godfrey steps forward to throw a knockout punch. Johnson backs and dodges the blow. Champion pounces. Johnson grabs and holds. Pugilists stagger in a clinch across the ring. Referee pulls on the two to separate. Godfrey lands a right to the chin, and the referee immediately waves the bout's over disqualification. Godfrey had lost the title for hitting during a clinch break. The crowd cheers and boos simultaneously. Referee Williams raises Johnson's arm and declares him victor as a new champion. Members of the Crib Club began to debate the merit of Johnson's victory and the fairness of the referee's disqualification. Bat Masterson is a local icon. Masterson has settled into Colorado as a sports writer who specializes with boxing. Masterson, who once convinced the Colorado governor to extradite serial killer Doc Holliday back to Arizona on a murder warrant by arguing he would be hanged without a fair trial, uses his clout and persuadability to argue the disqualification should be reversed. Bat Masterson others eventually win this argument, and the decision is reversed. Johnson is awarded $50 for the losing effort. A $850 prize money is redistributed to Godfrey, with him getting $750. Godfrey is ecstatic by the turn of the events. Godfrey returns to Boston, informing the newspapers, "I will never got among a square group of people than I found in Colorado." Godfrey was a good Christian who was proud of his personal morality. He would not want a win by deceit. He was likely discontent and feeling wronged when the title was briefly stripped in a bout in which he was dominating. In Boston, where both pugilists were popular, the sporting men became more vocal that John L. Sullivan should fight George Godfrey the outright heavyweight title. New York City. San Francisco and Chicago media would soon follow the increasing howls that Sullivan's racism was wrong and that he was out of shape and not the same dominant fighter from 1879 to 1886. Godfrey would ultimately open the door for other black boxers as equal or superior to their white counterparts. Godfrey deserves recognition that his skills as boxer and class as a person eventually led to longtime black heavyweight champion Jack Johnson battling the undersized white Canadian Tommy Burns for the unqualified title. George Godfrey was at his peak of boxing, fame, and reputation. It had made him a target for any pugilist seeking his defeat for their own gain. John L. Sullivan remained the undefeated white heavyweight champion despite his idol status. Jake Kilrain gained tremendous fame in a defeat versus Johnson with a bare-knuckle fight of 75 rounds. Kilrain had already lost a 4-round glove decision bout to James Corbett. When Sullivan avoided all black pugilists, Kilrain actively sought to fight George Godfrey. While I am fond of George Godfrey, if Jake Kilrain defeated the 38-year-old fairly, would credit such. I'm a historian first and a boxing cheerleader second. The bout was held in San Francisco for a bout prize of $5,000. 192-pound Kilrain was a 4-5 gambling favorite over the 174-pound Godfrey. The crowd is heavily on Kilrain's side. The reality is that Jake Kilrain fought dirty throughout. In the 5th round, spectators booed Kilrain when he grabbed Godfrey by the neck and placed him in a headlock. Kilrain landed several illegal punches to the head while the referee did nothing. In the 25th round, Kilrain pinned Godfrey onto the ropes. Kilrain illegally holds Godfrey's head in place with his left while pounding the side of his head with his right. Those tactics would be legal for bare knuckle, but not gloved Marquise Queen rule berries. The 26th round continues the illegal tactic of holding and punching by Kilrain. The referee must be part of a fix, so he does nothing. Both pugilists have swollen eyes. Godfrey remains civil and only smiles. Godfrey's pride, perhaps foolish, is avoiding falling to the canvas, so he holds ropes which leave him defenseless. Kilrain pounds the exposed body. If frustrated and tired, Kilrain illegally grabs Godfrey and wrestles him to the canvas. It's not a knockdown. Kilrain's fans cheer their fighters' persistent cheating. As usual, the referee does nothing. An exhausted and weary Godfrey rises to his feet. Kilrain pounces with punches that batter Godfrey across the ring. Godfrey is forced to the ropes while Kilrain pushed and punched while he knocked his opponent through the ropes. It is the first official knockdown of the bout. Kilrain supporters surprisingly cheer Godfrey's unwillingness to quit. Both are fatigued to the point of not fighting after the 43rd round. The 44th round conclude with a Jake Kilrain punch scoring a knockout. So we can see in that reading that Kilrain used all kinds of illegal tactics, holding Godfrey's head and hitting him, and eventually just brutalized his way to a knockout win because he was unable to get disqualified by the referee. So he brutalized his way to his victory over George Godfrey, and a rather disgusting one it was. So we have one final reading here, and we're going to take a moment here and hear some words from another contemporary boxer, as there's no better commentary than how another boxer actually viewed them. And we are going to hear the words of Kid Mccoy describe his feelings for George Godfrey, Old Chocolate. Okay, Old Chocolate termed one of the greatest stars of yesterday. Kid Mccoy was once the greatest of fighters, gives all the present-day crop of glove pushers full credit for their achievements. But like others of the old school ringmen, Mccoy cannot help but add interest to every fanning bee of fistic affairs by recalling some of the old-timers whose work in the wake of the resin impressed him. Speaking of the veterans, recently, Mccoy dwelled on some length on the old guard known as Old Chocolate George Godfrey. Better known to some, Godfrey had passed to the great beyond. He never met Mccoy, but the kid was perfectly familiar with his ring achievements and always maintains Godfrey was one of the very best colored men of the ring ever produced. Godfrey was a fighter. He knew but little of the scientific end of the game, but he was as game as a pebble and took on nearly all the big-time people of the crowd, although he once refused to meet John L. Sullivan, having challenged John L. Sullivan recently. Godfrey's ring career drew to an almost abrupt close. He was given a terrific beating by Joe Choyinski at the Coney Island on a Halloween night of 1892. The mill went 15 rounds, and Choyinski punched Godfrey until it appeared the latter would cave in. He finally took the count, and on May 28, 1894, he got another lacing from Peter Maher, and then he decided to call it quits. Godfrey was a hustler. He was perhaps one of the most thrifty of all the colored fighters. He worked in a butcher shop in the Boston market during the latter day and trained at night. He also worked at night on the foundation of his home. When the home was completed, he married a white woman, and they settled down for years and ran a boxing school and gym. His patrons were fistic fans whom he had become acquainted with during his ring days. Kid Mccoy declares Godfrey was one of the most wicked punchers the game had ever known, and although it was quite difficult for him to land because of his judgment of distance was sadly off color, but Old Chocolate was strong, and when he was landed one of his punches and it did find the mark, it was nearly always accompanied by a bone-crushing force. Mccoy maintains Godfrey would have made a barrel of money in this day and age because he was a rough and tough miller who would be very unkind to the present-day boxing pugilists. So that there is some of the thoughts on Old Chocolate George Godfrey. And Old Chocolate George Godfrey, your boxing profile is coming up.